Greetings everyone and welcome to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode we're continuing on with our VCA series. Joining us back in the studio again for a little help with that is our good friend Mr. Ronnie Wong. Ronnie, welcome back to the show. How's it going?
Well, thank you. It's a great day to be right here as we continue on with the VCA 6 series. Today we're actually jumping into the actual technology I've been promising that we're going to jump into, which is, of course is the idea here of vSphere and some of the technologies that we are going to deal with. And the reason why we have to do this, of course, is because really the whole idea, right, is to get you familiar more with actually working with vSphere. But before we do that, we want to make sure, of course, that you understand some of those technologies. We took a look at some of the different editions and talked about those technologies just briefly. Today we're going to get a little bit further into it. We're not going into, of course, every technicality, but we want to make sure that you understand what these particular topics are, that you can identify them, and understand what the features are behind them. And that's what we're actually taking a look at. Okay? So let's start off in the very beginning here when we start taking a look at identifying some of these components for data center virtualization. First one we want to take a look at here, of course, is the hypervisor itself. So let's go ahead and do so. Let's take a look at my screen, and that will help us to get set up the way that we need. Now, when it comes down to it, we've talked about hypervisor in general, but in terms of VMware, you're actually going to use a hypervisor that's called ESXi. And I don't know, I'm going to start flipping those letters around. I can feel it in my head that that's not going to actually come out.
That's going to be bad, right?
I know, it is. It's not even the same product.
Yeah.
That's the problem. So on ESXi, right, this is our bare metal hypervisor. You want to make sure you remember that because remember there's a hosted and there's a bare metal. This one is the bare metal hypervisor. The key here in understanding and getting ready for also getting prepared for all the things that are coming up for you, which includes the exam, that's why I'm trying to emphasize it without saying that, is maximum capabilities. If you go ahead and set VMware on a single server, okay, what in the world can ESXi recognize? Well, you can actually have a server, and I've never seen this, Daniel, and you may have, but I've never seen this, an actual server, 480 CPUs. Okay, that's a lot of sockets.
I can't say that I've been privy to a 480 CPU machine in my life.
12 terabytes of RAM on a single server. Yeah, see, for him, 12 terabytes, yeah, no big deal.
Got that.
Yeah. And this single one can, of course, host 2,048 VMs. Okay, on a single one. Now, the strange thing is these things can be clustered together, right? And on the maximum cluster size, you can actually have up to 8,000 VMs in a VMware cluster, in an ESX hosted cluster. So just kind of amazing when you start doing this. When you only go and get the idea of ESXi, it's free. You can actually download it for free. It's something that you can do, but you don't get any of the other features. So in this particular management interface, the only thing that it's really going to ask you for is actually a username and a password, okay? And normally we're going to set a static IP address to it, but that's about it. I have never actually had to do anything else with just the ESXi server itself. Okay, so it does allow you to create an initial data store. When you actually run through the install, it'll say, hey, what do you want to actually create as your data store? You pick whatever hard drive that's actually available to you there, and that's where you would actually do it. And that can actually be locally on that machine, or it can actually be somewhere else. It just depends on what that server recognizes from that point. So you have a basic client interface that you can actually use, and you also have a web interface. So that means once you actually get it set up, you have to go to another machine, and this is the key kicker, right? You can't do it from a Mac, okay? You have to be on a Windows machine to actually be able to do that. Now, I say that. They've changed it if you're going to try and use this management client. So if you log into the website, it's going to give you the ability to download a management client, and you can do that, but it only runs from a Windows machine. If you use the web interface, though, you can manage it from wherever you want to. So you can actually take that, and then you're up and you're ready to go. Here is kind of one of the funny things here, okay? With version 6 of vSphere, the web interface is actually preferred, not the client interface itself. So I wanted to show you that. Let me see, did I actually pull this thing up? I think I did here. Yeah, I did, okay? So inside of if you go to the VMware Learning website, right, you can actually register for this and actually have access where you can test drive vSphere 6. Okay, so that's what I wanted to actually show you here, is that you can actually do something like this and be able to test drive this thing right here and be able to get access to it as well. And in ESXi, which what I was trying to say here, oh, on the web interface, that's what I wanted to do. So I'm there in the web interface. I wanted to show everybody something. if you download and install that particular client, and let's see if I can actually zoom in so that you can see this, all vSphere features introduced in vSphere 5.5 and beyond are only available through the actual web client. So they're saying, look, hey, this client is still there because we're not changing that, but if you want to actually use the client, you're going to see that there's some features that are not going to be available to you beyond 5.5. So they are pretty much saying, look, we're kind of abandoning that. And so that way you actually just simply open up the web client and you are now ready to go. But take some time and go and register inside of VMware's learning website. And you actually see, as you go through, you have to look for it, but it'll give you something like this where you can actually access that as well. Okay? All right, so when you take a look at that, that's kind of the basic feature for the idea of ESX. Now, I wanted to also mention this. So if you have your hardware and you tend to run ESXi, the terminology that you're going to become familiar with is what we call an ESXi host. Don't want you to mistake that when you see it someplace later on in your future. You know, when they say, on this host or on this ESXi host, what are they referring to? They're referring to what? A server that's running the hypervisor is what they're referring to. So don't mistake that when you hear it. You're not talking about a VM. That's what I wanted to get to. You're actually talking about the physical machine itself. That's kind of the underlying software that really helps us to run everything that we would actually have on hand to do so. So that's one of the basic technologies we should at least know.
Yeah, that's right. Now, obviously we have our hypervisor. We have our client that allows us to connect to our hypervisor. But we also have a server software to go along with this as well, right, Ronnie?
We do. And you might be wondering, like, well, if I can manage that and create VMs just like you said and be able to access, you know, at least a basic management, consolidate and do all that stuff, what else do I need? Well, this is if your business grows. So let me now show you another example instead here, okay? The time that you really do need vCenter server is if you know you're going to be running vSphere. Let's just go ahead and put that. Okay, if you go, I know I need those features inside of vSphere, you got to have vCenter. You just have to. Without vCenter, you don't have access to any of that stuff. So you got to make sure that you do purchase and that you are going to run this. The reason why you would run this is if you have multiple ESXi hosts, and now you want to actually be able to use the management features inside of vSphere to be able to control access to all of it. Okay? So now you might have a single centralized type of data store in which you actually create all of your VMs in, but you can access them from any one of these hosts here. Well, the basic management that actually conglomerates all that information together that gives you that ability to do so is really that underlying technology as well. So you have now that hypervisor, and then if you want to conglomerate everything together with multiple hosts, cluster them, this is where it actually begins, is right here using that vCenter server as well. So this allows you to run multiple hosts, allows you to ensure security, availability, you name it. Management tasks can all be simplified because it's actually through here that all that is aggregated together and then sent out to vSphere or vRealize as well. Helps to reduce complexity, and the reason why is if not, that means you have to go to every single one of these ESXi hosts to manage them on their own. The other thing that vSphere does at the heart, or this vCenter, excuse me, at the heart here, is that it can restart a failed VM, okay, without user intervention. So that means if you have a VM that locks up and ends up failing, you don't have to go in and restart it. vCenter server, excuse me, can recognize when a VM actually stops sending what they call a heartbeat, and when it does that, it can say, hey, I need to actually restart that sucker. So if it doesn't sense the heartbeat, it can actually do that as well. Monitoring utilization, and if you start allocating resources in terms of pools, that's where you can also go to. So this thing right here is actually a very essential part of everything that goes on inside of vSphere. So remember, the host itself, ESXi, and the vCenter server, you're probably never going to actually have to touch much more besides that, because when you actually launch into that client, you actually did see, let me show you if I can see this again here. Let me launch it from Google Chrome. That's the one that I like using. Well, I'm lying to you. I was going to say normally it actually just launches right up there. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So it says vSphere Web Client, and you can see where it's actually taking you. It says VMware vCenter Sign On. So it's actually trying to connect into that software right away and give you all the management features that you're looking for. So you can also end up seeing stuff like that. So there is a lot of that that's actually there for as far as some of the benefits and some of the features go. But right here, these are kind of the two underlying technologies, not the flashy end of things, but at the same time, without this, you can't do it.
That's right. And this is definitely the meat and potatoes, the basics of getting the VMware environment into your actual environment. Now, that being said, we're talking about how this is working for us and what we need to know about VMware using vSphere and the clients and all that other good stuff. But one of the main things that comes up a lot, and as much as we'd like to, and this does help us out with consolidation, eventually you're probably going to buy another server. You're going to have, or you're going to get a server that's more robust. It's got better hardware. It's got better, processor, CPU, or processor, CPU, same thing, memory, those types of things. And I want to take what I've got on this server and I want to move it over to that one. That's the foundation of the knowledge. There's many ways in which I'm talking about migration. I'm migrating virtual machines, all sorts of resources that the VMware system uses. How do I do that? And they've really made this almost idiot-proof. It's amazing, isn't it?
This is by far I think it's one of the neatest technologies that's out there. When you do virtualize, when you are running that vCenter server and you've got multiple ESXi servers ready to go, let me show you what Daniel was mentioning. We have a technology underlying everything also that's actually built into vSphere called vMotion. Okay? So when you actually do install it, it gives you this ability to do this. Now what Daniel is talking about, right, is that every single virtual machine essentially is made of a file, okay, that actually controls all the settings, that says, here's what my hardware is. And it actually has another file for storage, which represents its hard drive, is what we actually end up seeing. So I tried to make them a little bit different when we see that. What Daniel's actually saying is, if I need to move this because that particular machine is failing, and I need to move it over to another one, or even to I grabbed the server instead, or to another one instead, well, we can actually do that. Traditionally, when we've actually done this in the way that I've done it, it's simple. You normally have to go ahead and do this. You first have to shut down that VM, okay? Then what you would do is you would take this file and you can actually copy it and then paste it over onto another ESXi server. Make sure that that's actually done. Verify that it's still linked to the actual disk file. In other words, does this actually still show that same location on that disk file? If not, it's not going to start up. Verify that it's actually still there, and then you can turn it back on and you are ready to go. Okay? Well, what in the world did vMotion end up doing? vMotion actually ends up saying this: we want you to be able to do that, but you shouldn't actually have to worry about turning this thing off to do it, or you should have as minimal downtime as needed. So when something begins to happen in terms of vMotion, and you know that either because of resource utilization, in other words, ESXi is now straining for resources, vMotion inside of vSphere can say, oh, I need to move VM1. If I move VM1, I need to move it over to another one that actually has the capabilities available. Well, here's the way it does it where it actually seems almost instantaneous. Instead of actually having to move the actual file as well as VMware or VM1 here, it simply goes ahead and it copies what we call the system state data as well as what's in RAM, and they combine that into what we call a bitmap, right? They take a copy of that bitmap and they go ahead and they paste it onto another location, and while that one is running, right, they suspend it over here and they resume that over here. So now notice that the original file is still in its location, or as far as the hard drive goes, and now that bitmap image is copied over. So instead of having to move everything, right, and verify everything, it just says, here's what I can do. I can copy and paste a very small file and essentially move it over there, and the system state data, resume it, and it's ready to go. So vMotion is one of those technologies that actually makes it seem seamless, right? That you and I don't have to actually shut anything down. It can do it with very minimal downtime and almost zero downtime in the way that vMotion ends up working if you have everything in the background that it actually needs to work here. So of course that means a high-speed network, everything else is there. If you actually have like a 10 gigabit, it is almost instantaneous if you do it, okay? If that's actually what's underlying your technology. Most of us may not actually be dealing with 10 gigs, but at the same time, it's not bad unto itself when you really aren't. Now, the other technology that we also want to actually think about is sometimes you also have to move, of course, the VM across long distances. In other words, across WAN links at this point too. If you now have to move this across WAN links, well, there's actually something called long distance vMotion that does the same thing that we're talking about, but now when you do it, they talk about a latency of about 150 milliseconds, okay, is what they have going on, even across WAN links, which are generally slower. So here, if I scroll down just a little bit, because it actually didn't kind of zoom in the way I thought it was going to. So let's say that we have somebody in Toronto, you have somebody in Miami, and this particular one needed to actually be motioned over there. Well, again, long distance vMotion would then go across a WAN link, but what they're saying is it shouldn't take any more than 150 milliseconds. Now, the latest figures that you can actually read on VMware's site is saying, look, we're saying 100 milliseconds, but I can't tell you for the exam whether it's actually going to be 100 or 150. Just kind of accept that whichever one of those two that you see, in other words, if the other one's excluded, it's probably the other one. So I can't sit there and go, here's exactly what it is, but you know, either one of those two. More than likely, I think you're going to see that the exam is probably a little bit older, so you might actually take a look at that figure as being, you know, the one that you'll probably see, but I can't tell you that for sure. But just kind of realize that the newer ones, if you go to the website, you'll see 100 milliseconds, so I don't want you to get confused there. Long distance vMotion is a big one that's actually a technology for us too. There's also something called storage vMotion that allows you to do the same thing with the actual storage devices themselves so that you don't have to move them as well. Now, it gives you the ability to move them as you actually need to, but it can actually manage it for you if you actually give it the ability to do so. So you have a manual mode and you have an automatic. If you actually do the manual mode, you can move it however you want to according to policy, whatever, or you can actually say, just automatically adjust it. If there's actually contention or something over here, let's do the other thing that we actually need there. So it really does allow for the easiest migration possible. That's one of the biggest technologies that we actually run across. And to me, it's kind of neat that somebody was smart enough to figure that out. That's not about the moving, it's about making sure that you really don't notice it if it actually is moved.
Yeah, and it's awesome to watch and see that actually work in real life. So if you ever get a chance to play with this stuff and use vMotion, definitely do it just so you can go, wow, that is amazing, because it's some really cool stuff. Now we're talking VMware here. One of the other things that they give us is they really address availability. They want to make sure that your environment has as little downtime and that everybody has access to everything that they need access to at every given possible moment. No one's 100% perfect, but man, do they really come at this angle really hard hitting, right? Don't they, Ronnie?
They really do. So when we talk about that, they talk about the idea of what they call vSphere HA, capital H, capital A, and a lot of times we just call it high availability. So let's take a look at that on my drawing as well, and that will help us out. Now, you actually see it's kind of based around the same idea here. So what happens to this virtual machine if the hardware goes down? Well, traditionally, right, if I only have one, well, that's it, I'm toast, okay? The very fact is, if the hardware goes down, that probably means what, that VM is actually going to shut down as well. Okay, that seems to be normal. That's exactly what we think about. But with high availability, using vSphere that goes on, what should happen between these is that when it senses that something is going on, once we have vCenter and all that stuff actually set up and high availability is actually available to us, what should happen is that inside of vCenter, there's a heartbeat, right? That VMware no longer sends that, and what that vCenter can actually do through high availability is say, look, that particular machine needs to actually be started up over here instead. So before it actually goes down, it makes a copy of it, and it goes ahead and it actually allows it to actually migrate and start it up over here too. So that way, even if we have a hardware failure, that VM automatically can start up over here on this side, and that is very much amazing without human interaction needed. It says high availability means I watch out for the entire system. So regardless if I have a hardware failure, then I will automatically start sensing that something's going on. Let me go and make a copy of it over on the other one, and we're up and running. You don't have to worry about even hardware failures. The one time that we absolutely worry about is when nobody's actually in the office, right? So high availability is a big one for us that really does help in that availability feature as well, okay? Along with that, of course, is the idea of fault tolerance. Now, you and I understand the idea of fault tolerance. We take one machine and we have a redundancy, right? One fails, the other one takes over, okay? Well, the way that this one works to actually have instantaneous fault tolerance, right? The way that we're used to is that machine fails, the other one, it takes a moment to spin up, then we are connected. When you actually make a VM on one ESXi server and you've got everything set up, it automatically creates an exact copy of it over on another VMware server, okay? And if you update this one over here, it also updates this one over here, okay? It absolutely actually does all that at the same time. The same thing even with the files. It will do the same thing as far as the hard drive goes. Now, you might be wondering, well, why in the world that would be true? If anything goes wrong with one of these, it doesn't matter which one, because it has an exact duplicate copy that's already operating, that one can go down. No big deal. It goes down, the other one's actually up and running, okay? And it's an exact copy of the one that's actually already running. So that's why this idea of fault tolerance is instantaneous. It really prevents any of that stuff that we have to worry about latency. Now, in the background, the only way that this works, though, is if you have an insanely high-speed network connection. Again, high availability would actually be the same way. The recommendation, but not the requirement by VMware, is that there is a 10 gigabyte backplane connection between these hosts if you're going to do that, okay? Now, if you don't have that, does it mean it won't work? No, it means it'll work, but it will slow down the performance of your machines, right? So every change that's made, it will actually have to send that change across to the other one. It just has to. So if you have a 10 gigabit connection in the backside, well, that's the way that you actually ensure that it actually works the way that it needs to. If it doesn't, okay, then you're going to have a lot of traffic go between. The traffic in doing this fault tolerance is what's called fault tolerance logging. I'm emphasizing it for a reason, right? So fault tolerance logging is actually one of the key terms that you have to realize. It's that replication traffic that goes between. And instead of saturating your entire network, right, if you're actually hooked into a regular switch and everybody else is, it says, look, in fault tolerance logging, let's use that dedicated link between these to send that traffic back and forth between. So we're not doing what? We're not absolutely actually saturating the entire network with this type of traffic instead. So that's what makes it very fast, incredibly efficient, and makes it with zero downtime. So high availability, fault tolerance tend to go hand in hand. So when would we use one versus the other? High availability is when the physical hardware goes down. In fault tolerance, this is when that VM, that operating system itself fails. In that VM, it says, I'm not operating anymore. The good thing is the other one's already spun up and it's ready and going. So you want to make sure you understand that difference. Fault tolerance, operating system VM goes down. High availability, it's because you actually need that when the physical hardware goes down instead.
That's right. Now, another wonderful ability of our vSphere, our ESX environment, is the ability to do clustering and resource pooling. Ronnie, like I said, they've done a great job of trying to find out all the ways in which you would need their help and address that, and they've done that here as well. Putting together large storage arrays, making them look like even larger storage array, or just working them across the different platforms. It's really awesome stuff.
It really is, because when we start talking about clustering, most of us just think about the idea of storage, okay? Well, in ESXi and in vSphere, they actually are clustering every resource that's possible in the data center, right? So you can cluster together ESXi hosts, okay, together into its own cluster so that they can actually be able to have up to 8,000 VMs. Now, I actually had 64 hosts, but I think that's actually 4 hosts. Instead, I don't know why I put 64 in my notes. I was looking at it like that's a little bit strange.
You like to confuse yourself.
I apparently do. So each one, you can actually have up to 4 ESXi hosts, and that means that each one of those can actually support up to 8,000. Every cluster can support up to 8,000 VMs there. Now, remember that if you do this, okay, and you start clustering that, inside of that particular cluster now, every single VM, you can actually turn on a VM. I don't know why you would do this, but you can. You could actually turn on a VM and actually tell it that it can have up to 128 virtual CPUs, okay? So if you absolutely have an application that will take 128 CPUs to make it operate the way it thinks it needs to, you can do that. And every single VM can have up to 4 terabytes of RAM if you need it to, okay? Now, I'm not saying you don't need that, but what I'm saying is I've never actually faced that situation where I've actually needed any more than 2 or 3 CPUs ever, even virtual CPUs as well. Okay, so that's one of those features that's actually very neat, because it shows the ability to scale out and scale up when you actually need it to do what you need. So vSphere clusters are something that they're actually set up for once you actually do have the things ready to go. The other thing that's also clustering, of course, is this idea of the storage that we have access to. Okay, so the good thing is once you actually have your ESXi cluster, it actually begins to look for, well, storage clusters as well. And one of the ones that's actually created, or that you can create, is what they call a virtual SAN. Okay, a virtual SAN allows then all of these ESXi hosts to be able to store their VMs on, let's say, this data store, even if they have no actual ability to actually host any VMs on their own. Okay, so it doesn't matter if ESXi has, you know, their own hard drives. In other words, they don't have any space, they can still store their VMs on this data store if they need to, and that's because it's a virtual SAN that everyone can actually connect to over that network link. So it really is kind of neat, again, in the very fact that clusters are actually helping us to be able to do that as well. Now, clusters then, when we start taking a look at it from the standpoint of host, and then you actually add in your data store, which becomes a virtual SAN, and you start doing all this stuff, which means that for management purposes, we consider them resource pools. Now, what the heck is a resource pool about? It's about taking whatever is remaining that's available and you managing it however you want to. So it's essentially a management container. You can put all of your drives, or you can put some of your drives, and you can say, I'm going to actually create this resource pool for these guys, and then you can divide up that storage however you want to. Okay? So you don't have to actually worry whether it's actually a different type of storage device or not. It becomes one big resource pool for you to do so. The same thing with the CPU, to be able to distribute the CPU usage as well as the networking. All of that can actually become part of your resource pool to be able to manage together and say, here on these 2,000 VMs, they're going to have access to this much networking. And you can actually say that. Do you actually have all those cables? No, but you know, if that actually is the capacity that you have, you can do that in terms of the resource pools to help you to do that. Now, the way that this is done is through a technology that they call DRS, right, which is the Distributed Resource Scheduler. Okay? The Distributed Resource Scheduler is what ensures that we can actually do all the stuff that we need to and still operate our network the way that we need to and still do the maintenance that we need to, if we can, without having any planned downtime. Okay? We're not talking about unplanned downtime. That stuff will happen just whenever. But we're saying, look, if we need to actually go ahead and say, I've got to work on ESX3, okay? We see that there's a failing stick of RAM, right? That DRS, that Distributed Resource Scheduler, we can tell it either by giving it a predetermined time that you're going to move all those VMs off of there, as well as actually ensure that all of the actual, you know, virtual disk, which I couldn't remember what I was going to say, is moved to another data store somewhere else. You can go ahead and schedule that. And that way, you can turn this machine off, replace the RAM, do whatever else you need to, bring it back online, and then go back into the resource scheduler and tell it to actually migrate things back over after everything's actually good and done. And imagine that. I can't even imagine what it would actually have to be like if I had 15 or 20 of these servers and going, you mean I've got 120 VMs that I've got to move, and I don't have any way to actually do that automatically? I've got to actually find room across all these different devices to do so, and they have to actually be on and operating and doing the performance level checks that we need to. That's why you actually use something like vSphere, right? So all these technologies that we're talking about, we're going to see a little bit more on, but those are kind of the basic ones that we want to make sure that we get access into and understand what's actually going to be happening. So there is a ton of technology, okay? Do you have to be at least familiar with the features of them? Yes, okay? So pay attention, make sure you go back through this episode again, because it really is going to help you as you actually get ready for this exam.
Yeah, Ronnie, obviously there's a lot of great features and functionality built into the ESXi, and vSphere environments. So definitely follow Ronnie's advice. Go back through these. Make sure that you don't have to be like the vSphere guy, right?
Yep.
But for this exam, you do have to be familiar with them and just at least basically what they do and how they work. Ronnie, you did a great job of explaining that. We really appreciate you stopping by and doing that for us. Hopefully you guys learned out there, and if you didn't, Watch again and again until it starts sinking in up here. Again, thanks for dropping by, Ronnie, and thank you guys for watching. We're going to go ahead and sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
And we'll see you next time.